Welcome to the Pharmacy Podcast Show. You are listening to the first and only podcast dedicated to the business of pharmacy. You can find all of our episodes at pharmacypodcast.com.
Welcome to the Pharmacy Podcast. I'm your co-host in 2017, focused on your career development, Erin Albert. More on me over at my website, erinalbert.com. Today, I wanted to bring you, once again, focused on your career development, a topic that I've heard consistently during the year of 2017, serving another organization called Healthcare Business Women's Association. And this year, I am president of the Indiana chapter of that organization. And it's an internationally recognized organization of over 8,000 members, specifically focused on gender parity and promoting women in leadership roles, specifically in healthcare and life sciences. And one of the consistent conversations I keep having over and over again with women, many of whom are very frustrated in terms of their career development, mid to later career, is the idea that women have in healthcare and life sciences very strong mentors at this point in their midpoint of career. Where they're really struggling right now is finding and fostering relationships with sponsors. And we'll get into it with our guest about how I define those differently, and we'll see if he defines them differently as well. But with that, I wanted to bring you one of my career sponsors over the past 15 years or so. I actually started working for him way back in the day when I started in the pharmaceutical and biotechnology industries. And our guest tonight is Dr. Harlan Weisman. And he has over 20 years of experience as a senior healthcare executive and physician responsible for discovery, development, regulatory approval, and launch of innovative pharmaceutical, biopharmaceutical, medical device, and diagnostic products. He's currently the founder and managing director of &1 Consulting, LLC, advising medical product companies, investment firms, government and NGO healthcare organizations in formulating and implementing successful strategies for driving innovation in healthcare products and services. And prior to that, Dr. Weisman served as chairman and CEO of Coronado Biosciences, a biopharmaceutical company engaged in the development of novel immunotherapy biologic agents for autoimmune diseases and cancer. And prior to Coronado, he served over 20 years as a senior executive at Johnson & Johnson. He was the chief science and technology officer of the J&J Medical Devices and Diagnostics Group from 2006 to 2012. Prior to that, Dr. Weisman worked at Centocor, which was acquired later by Johnson & Johnson. And that's where I worked for him in clinical operations. And Dr. Weisman professionally has done a lot of other things. He's served on PCORI, which we all know is the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute. He's on currently several different company boards. He actually was an assistant professor back in the day at Johns Hopkins University. And he is a cardiologist by training and went to the University of Maryland. And his MD was also obtained from the University of Maryland School of Medicine. So with that, let's get into it. A conversation with one of my sponsors, Dr. Harlan Weisman. Well, Dr. Harlan Weisman, thank you for joining us on the Pharmacy Podcast.
It's my pleasure, Erin.
So good to have you. So I always start with the same question with all of my guests. How did you get to where you are today?
Okay, well, just in brief, my journey. As a undergraduate, I was actually a philosophy major, but was interested in medicine and did go to medical school. I did an internal medicine residency, and then I did a cardiology fellowship and trained in cardiovascular disease. I became a consultant cardiologist and a researcher at Johns Hopkins. And was then called by a recruiter to look at a biotech company, a position with a biotech company called Centocor, where Erin, you and I met. And Centocor was an interesting company because at the time they were pioneers in monoclonal antibodies. Monoclonal antibodies today are frequently used and are important therapeutics. But at the time Centocor was beginning, monoclonal antibodies were thought by many never to have a future as therapeutic agents. Anyway, being at Centocor was a really interesting experience. It was a typical biotech roller coaster with thrilling ups and frightening downturns. We read our obituary for the company a number of times in the Wall Street Journal and other financial publications, but eventually emerged with 2 approved products, and shortly thereafter we were acquired by Johnson & Johnson. I was the head of research and development at Centocor at the time of the acquisition, and then a short while later I was asked to become the head of research and development for Johnson & Johnson Pharmaceutical Research and Development, which I did for a few years, and then I moved over to the medical device side, where I became the Chief Science and Technology Officer for medical devices and diagnostics. I left Johnson & Johnson in 2012 to open my own consulting practice, which I have today, and currently serve on the board of biotech and medtech companies, and as an advisor to several medical schools and investment funds. One of the companies that I was on the board of, I had a brief stint as the CEO. The board decided that there was a need to bring in a new CEO because of some struggles that were going on, and I did that for about a year, and then turned the company back to the management team. One of the most interesting things I've done in the last few years was to serve on the board of governors of something called the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, or PCORI, which was started as part of the Affordable Care Act. And the whole idea of that was to help patients and clinicians get the best available information to help them in decision-making about their care, whether it was around prevention, treatment, diagnostics, or otherwise. And that was we started as a startup, built the institute, and now it's up and going and funding lots of really interesting research. I had a 6-year term, and rather than seek a renewal of another 6 years, I decided to leave, thinking that 6 years was enough for me and enough for them.
Very good. Well, so tonight's conversation that I wanted to have with you as one of my sponsors, I mean, I consider you one of my sponsors, is kind of the struggle that I've been hearing from many women in part of my role with Healthcare Business Women's Association this year, in that we work a lot with mid to later career women in healthcare and life sciences. And although it seems as though women are getting, more opportunities to kind of break through the glass ceiling. Just here at the beginning of April, GSK announced their first woman CEO of a top 15 pharmaceutical company globally, which was exciting. But a lot of women struggle with finding sponsors. And so I define sponsors a little bit differently than mentors. Mentors are people that are going to guide and help you. They may work or they may not work for your company. Whereas sponsors are people at high levels within the same organization in which you work that will fight for you when you're not in the room. And so I brought you on the show because we have a really good story around sponsorship when I was at Centocor and I worked for your office. And I really wanted to kind of, from your perspective, from the sponsor's point of view, figure out if there's ways that we can help our listeners find, identify, and kind of cultivate, if you will, the sponsorship relationship rather than just the mentor relationship. So let's start with, do you personally view sponsorship and mentorship differently?
I think the way you defined it is perfect. And I would agree that a sponsor is somebody who works at the same company as the mentee. And whereas a mentor doesn't have to do that, sometimes the sponsor is the direct supervisor or the head of the same department. But this also doesn't have to be true. I believe, in my way of looking at it, that a sponsor does play a mentoring role, but also introduces the mentee to key leaders in the company, makes the mentee visible, helps them obtain assignments that will help their growth and development. if the mentee is in the sponsorship department, my view, when that's been the case, is I always considered that person working in my group to be on loan to me, to be somebody that would be returned back to the company well equipped for their next role and hopefully accelerated in a way that otherwise wouldn't happen. So sponsorship is an extraordinarily important part of what I think any leader, manager should be doing in terms of helping their employees grow and develop. At Johnson & Johnson, for example, I did try as often as I could to take people who were working in my group and give them exposures to others throughout. And a success for me would be if they left my group. That was always a painful experience. It's not something from a self-interested way that you want to happen, but it's something that's really necessary. When you are helping people grow and develop, you're undoubtedly going to get the best out of them in terms of their efforts while they're working with you. And in terms of the company as a whole, the company will benefit. And again, self-centeredly, as a leader within a company, that helped me attract new talent into the organization because people knew that they would have those kind of opportunities presented to them.
So I guess my next big question for you is what type or what characteristics were you looking for in potential people to sponsor, male or female, within the organizations in which you worked?
Well, I think it was anyone who showed promise, somebody I would call a high potential or a rising star, who showed the potential to go beyond where they currently were. If I could see them in a couple years, not only being really good at what they currently do, but having the potential to go far beyond what they're currently doing, and then giving them the opportunities to grow and develop so that they could move on. What does that look like? I think it's somebody who delivers results, can think beyond the day-to-day to solutions that are more on a strategic, longer-term level. And it depends on the position, of course, and what the years of experience the individual has. Somebody with lesser experience may have a high degree of intelligence and savvy, but not have enough experience to contribute at that strategic level, but show the potential to do so. And my goals as a sponsor and as a mentor would be to give them those kinds of experiences so that they could grow into those larger roles.
Did you, during your tenure, particularly in the pharmaceutical industry, have mentors and sponsors, and how did you go about being the mentee?
Yeah, I was extremely fortunate to have several bosses who gave me opportunities and mentored me and helped me develop. This was giving me a degree of independence, giving me challenging assignments, and helpful advice along the way. And also one of the things I mentioned was for sponsors to provide the mentee visibility and giving me the visibility across the company so that people got to know who I was and what I was doing. This led me to appreciate the importance of sponsorship in one's career and to ensure that I, as a leader, had the obligation to do exactly the same thing. It was because of my experience, my positive experience, and my appreciation for the value that it brought to me, that I became completely devoted to the idea that that was an important part of what I needed to do as a leader.
Did you view your mentors and sponsors throughout your career as kind of like a board of advisors, or did you seem to have one in particular at a certain point in your career? What was your approach to your cadre of mentors and sponsors?
Usually, at any given time, there was one individual who would take me under their wings. I can tell you that at Centocor, Dave Hovack, who was the CEO of the company, took me under his wings, and we spent a year and a half together, just he and I, traveling around the country, understanding, ReaPro, the product that we were introducing, and what the challenges that it was facing, and coming up with a strategy to meet those challenges. Along the way, because I was traveling with him a lot, I both indirectly by osmosis, but directly through conversations, was able to learn a lot from him about life and in general, and about management and leadership. There were lots of lessons that he gave me along the way. There were things that he let me sit in on, which, in retrospect, clearly had the goal of allowing me to learn something new, whether it was in management principles, whether it was in interactions with partners, or otherwise. And along the way, after Dave ceased being my sponsor, because we brought in somebody new, Joe Scuderi, who became the president of Centocor, and he was in between Dave and me. Joe became my sponsor and mentor, and played a very similar role. After that, I would say, and even before that, along the way, even though there were not formal arrangements, I would observe people who I thought were good and do whatever I could to learn from them, whether we developed a formal relationship or not.
Okay. And so in terms of advice and flipping now, you're later on in your career, you're a freelance consultant, you've had all this experience within pharma. If you had a younger professional coming to you, male or female, but that's a two-part question. Let's go with either. What advice would you have for them to kind of gather up more sponsors within the organization in which they work?
Well, one thing that I think is important is to, and I've used the word a few times, is to make themselves visible. Don't be hidden. Don't wait for a sponsor to find you, but seek out people. Who are the people who have the reputation in your company in helping people develop? If you don't know, actively network to find out. And if there are opportunities that you have to meet them, make sure that you exploit those opportunities. But if there aren't, go make an appointment and meet them. If people are devoted to that notion of sponsorship, they'll be eager to meet you. I can tell you that at Johnson & Johnson, it was not infrequent for people to come see me from different, J&J has over 200 companies, who would be people from all over Johnson & Johnson who would make appointments to see me, not just me, but others who played those kind of sponsorship roles, to let me get to know them and meet with them. And frequently that would turn into repeated meetings, whether I took on the role of their sponsor or not. If I thought it was a worthwhile investment, I would make sure that I could connect them up to somebody who could play that kind of sponsorship role. So it's something really important not to be passive and not wait for somebody to find you. I also think it's important that whenever there's an opportunity to find challenging assignments, particularly those that have the potential to be game changers, go after them. It's important not to be arrogant, but to have the courage to be assertive when you genuinely believe you have a good idea, and stand up and be heard at meetings, because that's often an opportunity to become visible for people who can play that sponsorship role.
And so the second part of my two-part question there was, what differences have you seen between mentoring and sponsoring women in pharmaceuticals, healthcare, life sciences versus men, if any?
Okay, well, just in general, and this applies to men and women, often one of the biggest obstacles standing in the way of a person is themselves. And it's important to get out of your own way. And I think people carry around a narrative, a self-narrative, a story that they tell about themselves that they believe other people have about them. And it's really important to change narratives, to understand who you are and make sure that you are that person. I have found that this is particularly true for women. It is absolutely the case that there are real, objective, organizational impediments that are greater for women than men. And as much as companies try, it is true in terms of compensation. It's true in terms of promotional opportunities, particularly at senior levels. I think companies do a good job at more junior levels, not as good a job at more senior levels. Now, it's really important for companies to try to bring down these barriers. But it's equally true that self-imposed barriers have to be brought down. And that's why I think it really is important for women to be assertive. I said it's important not to be arrogant, but to have the courage to be assertive a few minutes ago. And my definitions for these are that arrogance is pretending to be who you're not. And we all know arrogant people, and one should never do that and try to be somebody else. Humility is knowing who you are, what your strengths are, as well as your weaknesses, and having the courage to be yourself. I find that often women, in telling their own stories to themselves, overemphasize their weaknesses and not play to their strengths. And in seeking sponsors, I'm saying that it really is important to be assertive and go out there and be yourself. Have the courage to be yourself. Men, look, I'm stereotyping because there's certainly men who are less assertive and women who are very assertive. But in general, I think that's the case. Men tend to be pushy and much more aggressive than women. And I think it's important for women in a very respectful, with humility, to put themselves forward and look for those opportunities, particularly in front of potential sponsors.
And should we have C-suite executives listening to this podcast, let's flip the question and ask, what suggestions do you have for, let's face it, be honest, there's a lot of older white males in C-suite positions within healthcare and life sciences. What can they do to increase gender parity?
Well, let's just talk, about the what I was just saying. One of the things I learned in meetings, because I said it's important for women to put forward their ideas, to be heard. Sometimes that's a struggle, because if in a again, I'm stereotyping, but in a typical meeting in which there may be 5 women and 5 men, the men will go out there with their ideas, and when the women try to speak, the men just raise their voices and talk over them. By nature, women tend to be more polite, and when the men are talking over them, they allow that to happen. I'm not saying the women should get into a mud fight with the men, but I think it's really important for the senior leader in that meeting, the executive, to make sure that he's giving airtime to the women and to be aware of those differences. And the fact is that they should be actively promoting the participation of women in not just in meetings, but on management teams, on leadership teams, and helping and encouraging women to seek those roles and to actively seek being sponsors for women. For the women that I've sponsored, I've done two things. One of them, I've tried myself to be a good sponsor, but I've also tried to identify a sponsor or mentor for them, and those mentors might be outside of the company, and so that they could be with somebody who might be more empathic to their situation than I could, because I just haven't been in their situation. I think it's really incumbent upon the stereotypical old white guy executive in the C-suite to be aware of the disparities and try to bring them down.
So I want to go back to one other comment you made about setting appointments with executives, and you said as long as there was value in that conversation, you would be happy to meet with those individuals. So what's the most valuable item, idea, concept that a mentee brought to you as mentor?
It was more than an idea. It was they as a person. It was, did that person, what was their level of energy and passion, intelligence, and my assessment on the spot of their potential? Did I view this as somebody who I thought give them as much rope as they need to succeed, and that would really benefit from being in a situation where they could have opportunity, if given the opportunities, they could really shine.
So with that, Dr. Weisman, where can people find you online and offline?
Okay, so online, I'm on Twitter and on LinkedIn. I'm H. Weisman on Twitter. Also, my email is and1, A-N-D, the number 1, consulting @gmail.com. And I'm happy to receive emails, or people can get me through LinkedIn or through Twitter.
I didn't know you tweeted, so I'll have to connect with you on Twitter.
I don't want to over-exaggerate. I'm on Twitter. When I was on Picori, I used to tweet a lot. I've not been as good about it as I used to be.
Well, Dr. Weisman, thank you for sharing your insights tonight. I know this is not an easy topic, and I know before we started recording, we had the conversation that we can't necessarily solve this with one podcast. But I think the more conversations we have around the honesty of having and finding and identifying and cultivating sponsorship relationships for women and young men, for that matter, in healthcare and life sciences, we can hopefully increase gender parity all the way to the top. So thank you. My pleasure. Thank you. So are you ready for the speed round? Sure. Okay. So what podcasts are you listening to right now? Well, I do it fairly randomly, but what I listen to regularly is This American Life and On Being. I really just love the stories on This American Life, and I really love the spiritual aspect of the stories of that are on Being. What books are you reading right now? Well, one book that I think would be important, and I'll say this with the caveat that most of what I'm reading is related to something called the microbiome, and I'll turn to that in a second. But one thing that's highly relevant to this conversation, and I didn't realize the emphasis on women in sponsorship, is something called Testosterone Rex. Oh. Subtitle is called Myths of Sex, Science, and Society. It's by a woman named Cordelia Fine. It was recently published, and it talks about many of the, not just the myths that we all know about in terms of the differences between men and women, but also the
subliminal and subconscious things that we carry as truths about men and women and differences between men and women that just happen not to be true. And I think it would be a really interesting book for your listeners, men and women, to read. I found it really fascinating. In terms of the microbiome, this is, I'll give you the titles and I'll give you an idea of what the microbiome is about. One is called the mind-gut connection, and I'm reading these sort of in parallel, the mind-gut connection, how the hidden conversation within our bodies impacts our mood, our choices, and our overall health. This hidden conversation is with the microbes that live inside of us. We're really an ecosystem which comprises us, and we're really outnumbered by the microorganisms in our gut and other places. There's another one that I'm reading called I Contain Multitudes, the microbes within us and a grander view of life by Ed Young. And then finally, The Human Superorganism, how the microbiome is revolutionizing the pursuit of a healthy life by Rodney Dietert. I'm very interested. I've been interested in the microbiome. The CEO the company that I was CEO of was revolving around the microbiome, and I've recently helped co-found a company that's to give with the mission to help consumers learn more about the microbiome. So that's why I'm reading all these books. One book that I turn to a lot, and I think it's worth mentioning because I brought up narrative a lot, is something called The Power of Story. The subtitle is Change Your Story, Change Your Destiny in Business and Life. It's by somebody named Jim Lair, and I think it's a fabulous book because it really talks about how we create these stories about ourselves and how destructive these stories can be and how important it is to change our stories to be positive.
I think he may have been at South by Southwest this year.
He may have been.
Yeah.
He runs something called the Human Performance Institute.
Okay.
Which J&J acquired, and he began as a sort of a life coach for troubled professional athletes, and has turned this into something in helping what he calls the corporate athletes.
So if you had one word to describe the U.S. healthcare system right now, what would that word be?
Struggling, but really having to deliver results that matter. You know, the healthcare system in the U.S., my shorthand for the healthcare system is, one, it's not a system in large part. Two, it's not about health. It's about disease management. And third, it's not about care. There's very little caring in healthcare. If we can make healthcare much more about emphasizing health and well-being, and much more about providing caring to people in a systematic way, I think we could correct things. That's lots more than one word, but that struggling is my overall word.
Got it. What's your favorite time management tip?
Well, this is something that I've told people in the past. It was taught to me is that you should have 3 lists: an A list of things that are important, the most important that you need to accomplish, a B list of things that if you finish your A list, you can turn to your B list, and a C list, which are the things that are below the B list. You should never touch the C list. It's a waste of time. And only concentrate on the A list, and occasionally there'll be things on the B list that you can move to the A list.
And last but not least, what's the best career advice you ever received?
I think I've told you this, Erin, but the former chairman of the board of Senecor once told me, Harlan, there are 3 kinds of people: people who make things happen, people who let things happen, and people who don't know anything is happening. And he said, Harlan, always be in the first category.
With that, Dr. Harlan Weisman, thank you for joining us on the Pharmacy Podcast.
It was my great pleasure to speak to you, Erin, as always.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Pharmacy Podcast focused on your career development. Don't forget, Pharmacy Podcast listeners, we live on your feedback. We want to hear from you. In my previous episode, based upon a LinkedIn post called 57 Cool Jobs for Pharmacists, I gave you a survey, and I'm going to link it up here to this episode show notes as well. I need your feedback on who you'd like to hear about moving forward on the Pharmacy Podcast focused on career development. I'm looking forward to your feedback. Can't wait to hear from you. And until next time, take care.